Alright, I'm not gonna lie, I don't really have an intro for this one. Basically, TLDR, I rewatched all the Spider-Man movies, just because I felt like it and I'm a nerd, but I kind of felt really unsatisfied after I finished Amazing Spider-Man 2, not just because that movie sucks, because, it does, but because I feel like Amazing Spider-Man 1 especially set up so much. And Amazing Spider-Man 2 tried to set up a lot because that was like the beginning of like the cinematic universe kind of era. So they were really strong on that. But point is, I feel like it had a lot of potential. And I feel like Amazing Spider-Man 3 could have been really interesting if they didn't cancel it. Because, you know, that's what Spider-Man executives clearly do. They cancel their movies whenever they do one bad movie, which is, it's annoying. Here's hoping for Beyond the Spider-Verse. Anyway, without wasting more time, I'll give you my pitch for Amazing Spider-Man 3. Peter, looking aged to about 30, sporting a full light brown beard, sighed into his reflection in the mirror. Peter Parker, you are not getting any younger. He then walks back out of the bathroom, greeting the newly arrived fellow members of the grief support group he'd been going to ever since Gwen died, which was when he was 19. He hadn't missed a session since. Not even the Spider-Man job, which remained steady throughout, could drag him away from trying to heal from Gwen. He is 32. He was 19. It has been 13 years. The basement of St. Bridget's Church smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old wood. The air was thick with quiet murmurs, the occasional shifting of chairs, the rustle of jackets as people crossed their arms over themselves. The grief support group sat in a loose circle, some clutching styrofoam coffee cups, others staring at the floor, lost in thought. Peter Parker sat in his usual chair, second from the corner, close enough to listen, but never quite at the centre. He had been coming here for 13 years. He had never missed a session, not once. Not for Spider-Man, not for anything. And yet, despite all that, he had never truly spoken. Across from him, Mary Jane Watson watched him carefully. She was close to his age, maybe a year or two younger, with long auburn hair tucked behind her ears. There was something steady about her, something unshaken by loss. She had been coming here for years as well, ever since her husband died. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but certain. My therapist told me something once, she said, that sometimes holding on to something doesn't keep you stuck, it helps you carry them. Peter's fingers curled into a loose fist on his knee. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral. For a long time, I tried to forget, she continued. I pushed everything of his away, thinking it would make it easier, but that's not what moving on is. Peter exhaled slowly through his nose, staring at the floor. What's one thing you still have of hers? Silence. A weight settled in his chest, pressing against his ribs. He clenched his jaw and focused on a crack in the tile, pretending he hadn't heard her. Mary Jane's voice softened. It's okay if you don't know right now, but maybe try looking. A murmur of quiet agreement passed through the group. The leader, a woman in her 60s, nodded in encouragement. Grief isn't about forgetting, she said. It's about remembering without letting it break you. Peter swallowed, the words catching in his throat like something too sharp to breathe around. And then, just for a second, he met Mary Jane's eyes. It was the first time in 13 years that someone had gotten through that wall. That night, Peter stood in the dim light of his apartment, staring at the closet door. His fingers hovered over the handle, hesitation tightening his shoulders. He hadn't opened it in years. The air around him felt heavy, charged with something invisible but suffocating. He forced himself to move, gripping the doorknob and pulling it open. Inside, Buried beneath old coats and forgotten boxes was a worn purple sweater. Gwen's. His breath hitched. Slowly, carefully, as if touching it might shatter him, he reached out and traced his fingers over the fabric. It was softer than he remembered, lighter, smaller. He pulled it out from the pile, holding it close, his eyes shut tight. For a moment, he let himself pretend she was there, just for a moment. But when he opened his eyes, the apartment was just as empty as before, and the weight of that crushed him all over again. Peter sat on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by a mess of old boxes. Dust hung in the air, stirred up by things that he hadn't touched in years. His hands worked through the pile mechanically, photo albums, scattered papers, a few of Aunt May's old keepsakes. Somewhere in here, buried beneath all the years of avoiding it, was something of her, Gwen. But instead, his fingers closed around something else. A tape. The plastic felt worn, the label slightly peeling at the edges. It was handwritten, the ink faded but still legible. Peter and Eddie, 1998. Peter frowned. The name sent a flicker of something through him. Familiar, but distant. He stood, crossing the room to an old TV setup. It took a few tries, but eventually the VCR whirred to life, swallowing the tape. The screen flickered, a moment of static, and then a home video. The camera shook slightly. The way it always did when someone's parents were filming, the image stabilized, revealing the inside of a cozy living room. Sunlight streamed in through the windows. In the center of the frame, a small boy, 5, maybe 6 years old, ran across the carpet, laughing. Peter's breath caught in his throat. It was him. He looked impossibly young, his dark brown hair slightly messy, a tiny shirt hanging off his frame. He ran towards someone off camera, practically bouncing with energy. And then another voice, deeper, amused. All right, slow down, kid. The camera panned slightly, revealing a teenage boy, maybe 12 or 13, with short blonde hair and a confident grin. He was sitting on the couch, ruffling little Peter's hair like an older brother would. Eddie Brock. Peter's chest tightened. Come on, Eddie, young Peter whined. You said we'd play. Eddie laughed, shaking his head. Okay, 1 round of hide and seek. But if I win, you gotta admit I'm the best babysitter ever. No way, Peter grinned. In the background, a woman's voice, his mother. She was laughing softly, probably filming. Richard, look at them, she said. You'd think they were actual brothers. The camera turned slightly, just enough to capture a glimpse of his father, sitting in an armchair, smiling. Yeah, he said. They kind of are. The screen flickered, the tape glitched, and then darkness. Peter sat frozen, staring at the blank screen. The air in the apartment felt too still, too quiet. He hadn't thought about Eddie Brock in years, not since they were kids, before everything changed, before his parents died, before their parents died. He swallowed hard, staring down at the old tapes still spinning in the VCR. First Gwen, now Eddie. Ghosts from a life he barely remembered were coming back to him. And something told him they weren't done yet. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place that felt timeless, where the music was just loud enough to fill the silence between conversations, but not enough to drown them out. The air smelled like whiskey, wood, and the faintest trace of cigarette smoke from the alley outside. Peter sat at the counter, fingers idly tracing the rim of his glass. He hadn't done this in a while, gone out just to be somewhere, to exist outside of Spider-Man, outside of grief. And yet, here he was. Across from him, Eddie Brock leaned back in his seat, nursing a beer, looking at Peter like he was trying to piece together the kid he used to know with the man sitting in front of him now. I still can't believe it, Eddie said with a grin, shaking his head. Peter frickin' Parker, after all these years. Peter chuckled softly, taking a sip of his drink. Yeah, well, New York's a big city. Not big enough, Eddie countered. Man, you were like my little shadow back in the day, always following me around, asking a million questions. Peter smirked. You're exaggerating. Am I? Eddie raised an eyebrow. Dude, you worshipped me. I was, 12? And you were this tiny 5-year-old with the biggest eyes, running after me like I had all the answers. Peter shook his head, laughing under his breath. You kinda did though, he admitted. You were cool, older, knew things I didn't. Damn right I did. Eddie took a swig of his beer. Still do. Peter rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. It felt good, familiar in a way he hadn't expected. Eddie exhaled, his expression softening. I miss those days. Peter nodded. Me too. A moment of silence passed between them. Not awkward, not heavy, just the kind that came with two people realizing how much time they had lost. Then Eddie leaned forward, resting his forearm on the counter. You know, our dads worked together. Peter blinked, caught off guard. Wait, what? Yeah, didn't you ever wonder how we knew each other? It wasn't just because our mum set us up on playdates. Our dads were in the same research division. They were working on some big project back in the day, some genetics thing. Peter frowned slightly, memories stirring in the back of his mind. He had never known much about his father's work, just that it had been important. What kind of genetics thing? He asked. Eddie shrugged. Hell if I know. I was just a kid. But I remember my old man talking about it once. Something about changing the future or whatever. Real dramatic scientist talk. Peter's fingers drummed against the table. Thoughts were already spinning. And your dad? He asked carefully. Eddie hesitated for half a second before sighing. Died not long after yours did. Peter glanced up, and for a moment he saw something in Eddie's eyes. Something unspoken, something raw. I'm sorry, Peter said quietly. Eddie gave a small nod, looking down at his drink. Yeah, me too. Another beat of silence. Then Eddie clapped a hand on Peter's shoulder, forcing a smirk. But hey, we're not here to mope, right? We finally ran into each other again. Feels like fate. So what do you say, Parker? Another round? Peter studied him for a moment, then let out a small breath of a laugh. Yeah, another round. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. That night had stretched on longer than Peter expected. The bar had thinned out, leaving only the late-night regulars and a few scattered conversations humming in the background. The neon glow from the beer signs cast a dim, flickering light over the counter, reflecting in half-empty glasses between them. Peter was relaxed, more than he had been in a while. Catching up with Eddie felt easy, like stepping back into something familiar. But the moment he thought about their childhood, his father, their fathers, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. And then Eddie said something that made it all click. You know, before your dad started working with Connors, he and my old man were onto something big. Peter's fingers, which had been absent-mindedly tapping against his glass, suddenly went still. Yeah, he said, glancing up. Eddie nodded, leaning in slightly. Yeah, some kind of biological breakthrough. Genetic therapy. Or at least, that's what I remember hearing. He smirked. Back then, I thought genetic therapy meant something like turning into the Hulk. You know, kid logic. Peter gave a small chuckle, but his mind was already racing. What were they working on? He asked. Eddie's smirk faded. He took a sip of his beer, considering the question for a moment before asking. Something called venom. Peter's grip on his glass tightened. Venom? He repeated. Yeah, some kind of organic material. A symbiote, I think they called it. My dad used to say it was going to change the world. Eddie exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. They thought it could cure cancer. Peter stared at him. Cure cancer. That didn't sound like something his father would just stop working on. But Peter had never heard anything about it. Not from Aunt May, not from Connors, not from anyone. It was like the project had been wiped out of existence. What happened to it? He asked. Eddie shook his head. No idea. All I know is that one day they were on the verge of something groundbreaking. The next, my dad was dead. Then yours. Then the whole thing vanished. Peter's stomach turned. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. His father had been keeping secrets. More secrets. And if whatever venom had been important enough to bury, I think someone wanted it gone. Eddie looked at him, eyes dark with something unreadable. Yeah, me too. Midnight. The city stretched out below him, bathed in neon and moonlight. But Peter wasn't paying attention to the view. From his perch high above, he had his eyes locked on one building in particular, Oscorp. For years he had let his father's memories stay buried under the weight of grief and time. But now he knew there was more. More than the newspaper stories that branded Richard Parker a traitor. More than the classified files he'd never been allowed to see. More than anyone had told him. He adjusted the straps on his gloves, rolling his shoulders as he crouched against the edge of the rooftop. Then, without hesitation, he jumped. Wind rushed past him as he plummeted, arms tight to his sides before he fired off a web, swinging low and fast. He landed against the glass exterior of Oscorp Tower, clinging to the side like an insect. The building was almost quiet at this hour, almost empty. Almost. Peter narrowed his eyes behind the mask. He had done his research. Security patrols every 15 minutes, camera on every major hallway. One locked lab in the lower levels, restricted access only. And that's where his answers were. He took a breath and crawled along the side of the building, keeping low until he reached a vent along the east wing. A quick shot of webbing to remove the screws, and he slipped inside, dropping down into the shadows. Now all he had to find was the Venom Project. He moved fast, sticking to the ceilings, his senses alert. Oscorp was eerily silent, the hum of electricity the only sound as he manoeuvred through the corridors. He was almost there, almost to the restricted wing, when a sudden voice crackled through the intercom. Unauthorized presence detected. Peter froze. Then red emergency lights flared to life. Well, so much for quiet, he muttered. A door slammed open in the distance, followed by the pounding of boots. Guards, armed, moving fast. Peter exhaled sharply. No more sneaking. He jumped down from the ceiling, landing in a crouch just as the first wave of security rushed in. It's Spider-Man, one of them shouted. Peter tilted his head. You guys sound way too excited about that. You getting a promotion? Then they opened fire. Peter dodged effortlessly, flipping over one guard and kicking him hard into the chest, sending him crashing into a wall. He shot a web at another's rifle, yanking it out of his hands before flipping forwards and knocking him out with a well-placed punch. The alarm blared louder. More guards poured in. You guys really should have stayed home, Peter quipped, twisting mid-air as a baton barely missed his head. He caught the guard's wrist, twisting it sharply before webbing into the floor. A second later, he slammed his foot into another guard's stomach, sending him flying into a console. Sparks erupted as the screen behind them started to glitch out. Another web shot, another guard down. A spinning kick, another unconscious. Peter landed in a crouch, panting slightly as the last guard hit the floor with a thud. The hallway was a wreck. Bodies groaned from the ground, tangled in webs or slumped against walls. The alarm was still screaming overhead, but Peter was already moving. Spider-Man was already running for his life. With one last glance at the destruction behind him, he sprinted down the corridor, disappearing into the depths of Oscorp, because he wasn't leaving without the truth. The lab was colder than the rest of the building. Peter could feel it the second he slipped through the reinforced door, his breath hitching slightly at the sudden drop in temperature. The red emergency lights cast eerie shadows along the walls, flickering against the rows of containment units lining the room. And at the centre of it all, a sealed chamber. Peter moved closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The thick glass was fogged over, but he could still just make out something moving inside. Slithering, pulsing, a black, liquid-like mass. Peter swallowed hard. This had to be it. The Venom Project, he murmured under his breath. He scanned the interface beside the chamber, fingers flying over the touchscreen, searching for any kind of access log. The files were encrypted, but from the few fragments he could see, his father's name was all over them. Richard Parker, Carlton Brock, subjects tested, unstable bonding, organic rejection. Peter's eyes darted back to the containment unit, his gut twisted. What the hell were they working on? Before he could think any further, the chamber suddenly hissed. Peter stepped back instinctively as the metal locks released, the reinforced glass beginning to slide open. No, no, no! Before he could react, it moved. The black mass inside lunged. A thick, inky tendril shot out. Moving faster than Peter could dodge, it slammed into his chest with unnatural strength, knocking the air from his lungs as it wrapped around him. Gah! He staggered, gripping at the living substance as it slithered up his arms, his neck, his face. It wasn't solid, it wasn't liquid, it was something in between. And it was pulling itself into him. Pain exploded through his body, a white-hot burning sensation that tore through his nerves like electricity. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his vision blurred. It's inside me, he thought. Everything went black. The black suit clung to Peter like a second skin, sleek and alive, its surface shifting in subtle patterns as though it were constantly reacting to his emotions. The deep black hue absorbed light, leaving him a shadow in the night. Silver veins ran through the fabric like webbing, pulsating with an eerie metallic glow. The spider symbol on his chest was sharp, its legs stretching wide across his torso. His eyes, now solid and glowing with an unsettling light, reflected a new, more menacing power within him. The suit wasn't just protecting him, it was transforming him, amplifying something darker inside. The city felt different now. There was something in the air, a tension, a crackling energy that Peter couldn't quite shake. His senses were sharper, his reflexes quicker. The weight of his newfound strength thrummed between his skin like an electric current, an overwhelming power that pulsed through him every time he moved. But it wasn't just the strength, it was the rage. Peter stood on top of a building, watching the street below. He could hear it, the sound of chaos, the pulse of danger, a robbery in progress. A group of armed men, masks pulled low, racing out of a bank, bags of cash in hand, the kind of thing Spider-Man dealt with on a regular night. Except tonight, Peter wasn't the same. The moment he landed on the ground, his legs barely touching the pavement before he charged forward. "Hey!" one of the robbers shouted, raising a gun. Peter barely flinched. A web shot out, snapping the gun out of the robber's hands before he even knew what happened. Peter's fist collided with the man's jaw with such force that the crack of the bone echoed down the alley. He hit the ground hard, unconscious before he could even cry out. The others froze, eyes wide with terror. They weren't used to this version of Spider-Man. Peter didn't care. "What the hell?" one of them said, pulling out another gun, shaking. Peter didn't want to wait for him to fire. In one fluid motion, he slammed his fist into the next man's stomach, sending him tumbling forward, gasping for air. Peter was on him before he even hit the ground, diving his knee into his chest with brutal force. "Stop, please," another robber begged, but Peter barely heard it. The symbiote was hissing in his mind, urging him forward. Faster, harder, more. Peter felt the rage rising again, the uncontrollable anger, the raw power that burned in his veins, pushing him to be something more violent, something unforgiving. He swung at another, his fist connecting with the man's face, the impact sending him crashing into a nearby car with a sickening thud. His head slammed against the door, blood splattering across the pavement. He's not dead, just to clarify. Peter stood over him. The robbers were no longer moving. His breath came in shallow gasps, the black tendrils of the symbiote still crawling up his arms, wrapping around his limbs like a second skin. He could feel the pulsing energy inside him, the raw, unfiltered rage. This wasn't Spider-Man anymore. This was something else, something darker. He wiped his fist against his suit, leaving streaks of blood. The world around him seemed to slow, the chaos of the street muffled. He felt alive, powerful, and he wasn't finished. A siren wailed in the distance. Peter didn't wait. He swung up to a rooftop, his limbs feeling more like steel than flesh, and he jumped, far, far away. Peter and Eddie sat in the back of a quiet cafe, the midday sun filtering through the windows, casting soft beams of light over their table. They had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, talking about old memories, work, and even their mutual frustrations about the way the world has turned out. The tensions from the earlier conversations had faded. For the first time in a while, Peter felt at ease. That is, until his spider sense suddenly blared in his mind. A sharp, overwhelmingly tingling sensation ran down his spine, making the hairs on his neck stand up. He froze mid-sentence, his hand tightening around his coffee cup, but his eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the danger. Eddie noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Peter's breath hitched. He felt the symbiote stir between his skin. This dark, pulsing energy beginning to activate. It wasn't like last time. This wasn't the familiar bond from the fight earlier. No, this was different. The symbiote was getting more aggressive, more demanding, and it wanted out. Peter clenched his fists under the table, trying to calm the surge of panic that gripped him. He had to hide it. He couldn't let Eddie see. He couldn't let anyone see. He forced a smile that felt like it was being stretched too thin. "Yeah, just a headache," he muttered, standing up abruptly. "You sure? You don't look fine." Eddie frowned, his voice laced with concern. Peter didn't have time to explain. The symbiote was pushing against his skin, the black suit crawling slowly over his hands, his neck creeping up his arms. He had to get out of there, now. Without saying another word, he turned on his heels, bolted for the door, his feet pounding against the floor, panic starting to rise. Eddie's voice called out to him, but Peter didn't stop. His spider sense flared again, urging him to move faster. He needed a place to hide, somewhere where no one could see him, somewhere where he could get control of this thing inside him. A church. Peter's chest heaved with each desperate breath, the symbiote still writhing beneath his skin. He had to hold it back, he had to control it. His fingers curled around the back of a pew, knuckles white as he fought the growing urge to let the suit consume him. But the pressure was building, and the more he fought it, the stronger the symbiote's desire to take over become. He looked around, his eyes landing on the old church bell hanging near the back. The clapper inside swayed slightly, its worn metal catching the faint light. A flash of memory crossed his mind. The symbiote had reacted violently to noise. Without thinking, Peter sprinted towards the bell. His heart raced, and he could feel the symbiote tightening, slithering, pulling at him as if it knew what he was planning. He reached the bell, hands shaking, and grabbed a long rope hanging from the ceiling. With a yank, he pulled it hard. The clang of the bell was deafening, reverberating through the church. Peter's body jolted, the shockwave of the sound hitting him like a physical force. The symbiote screeched inside his mind, an agonizing sensation that made him stumble, disoriented. He had to keep going. He pulled the rope again. Clang! The bell chimed louder this time, and the symbiote recoiled violently, writhing around his arms, stretching and pulling as if it were being torn apart. A sharp pain shot through his head, but he gritted his teeth, and yanked again. Clang! The bell echoed through the church, the noise piercing, and Peter felt the symbiote break further, splitting, then shrinking as if it fought the sound. It hissed inside him, the black tendrils flailing wildly, pulling away from his skin, desperate to escape the noise. Peter's vision blurred with the pain, but he didn't stop. He had to keep from taking control. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of the bell rang out with each pull of the rope, each violent chime shredding the symbiote more and more, forcing it to retreat. He felt it slip from his arms, from his chest, but it was still clinging to him, trying to stay. Peter gritted his teeth, pulling one last time. Clang! The bell rang a final time. This time, the symbiote pulled away completely, leaving Peter grasping for breath, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the battle. The church was silent again, save for the faint echoes of the bell's toll. Peter collapsed to his knees, his hand still gripping the rope, his heart racing. The suit was gone. He may have been weaker now, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he had control. The ringing of the bell continued to echo throughout the church, louder and more frantic with every pull of the rope. Unbeknownst to Peter, down below, Eddie Brock stood outside the church, his hand resting on the heavy wooden doors, his brow furrowed with worry, his mind clouded with thoughts of his old friend. He'd seen Peter run off in a panic, heard the unmistakable urgency in his footsteps. Eddie had followed, determined to find him. Eddie had always thought of Peter like a little brother. Their shared history, the time they spent together as kids, the bond between them, it had always been strong. And now, with everything that's been happening, Peter's strange behaviour, the secrets he was hiding, felt like something was going terribly wrong. Eddie just wanted to make sure Peter was safe. Standing in the quiet of the church's exterior, Eddie found himself whispering a prayer to no one in particular. It wasn't much, just a small hope that their fathers, long forgotten in the shadow of their brilliant but controversial work, would finally receive the recognition they deserved. And for Peter, a boy who had grown into a man, but who still carried the weight of loss, a man Eddie had always admired, a man who was like family. He prayed for his safety. He didn't expect anything to happen, but then, as if on cue, he heard a faint sound above him, a drip, and he looked up. A dark, vicious liquid was leaking from the bell tower, spilling down from the chain, dripping through the cracks in the ceiling. Eddie's eyes widened in confusion as the substance pooled on the stone floor at his feet. Before he could react, the liquid began to crawl up his shoes, his legs, the substance moving faster than he could comprehend. It spread across his body, dark tendrils wrapping around his limbs, pulling up his chest, covering his skin. It felt like fire and ice all at once, raw, alive, and powerful. Eddie gasped, his body jerking involuntarily as the substance latched onto him, bonding with him like a second skin. His eyes widened in shock and awe, and for a split second he thought he might be dreaming. But it wasn't a dream. The symbiote was real, and it was giving him power. Eddie's heart pounded in his chest, the sensation of strength flooding through him, heightening his senses. The dark tendrils of the suit wrapped around his body, forming into a black suit, sleek and menacing. His muscles grew tense as the alien symbiote melded with him completely. He felt the change, the surge of energy coursing through his veins, and something deep inside him snapped. The power felt like a gift, a sign and a gift from God. Eddie's mind cleared, and his vision sharpened. He felt no fear, no hesitation. He only felt an overwhelming need to protect, to fight. The transformation completed itself with a final rush of power. The familiar fit symbol of the spider reappeared, this time stretched across his chest, contorted into something more brutal. Eddie's eyes, once filled with confusion, now gleamed with a cold, intense resolve, glowing a sharp white as he looked up at the church's towering steeple. He was no longer Eddie Brock. He was Agent Venom, and he would protect those he cared about at all costs. Eddie's hands clenched into fists, the symbiote surging with him, and he knew in that moment that nothing, no one, would stop him from fulfilling his newfound purpose, not even Peter. His transformation was complete. Eddie Brock, once a man unsure of his place in the world, now stood tall, wrapped in the dark embrace of the symbiote. His breath was steady, but his mind was a storm, and within that storm, a new identity was being forged, a righteous force, a punisher. Eddie's eyes, those once warm, human eyes, now gleamed with a cold, unyielding white. The symbiote has fused with him completely, and the tendrils of black liquid shifted between his skin. Eddie felt something shift within him. He felt justified. His purpose was clear. The world has wronged him. The world had wronged him and his father. His father's legacy has been forgotten, overshadowed by the lies and deceit of those who had tried to bury the truth. And Peter Parker, his old friend, the one person who should have shared this mission, has abandoned them both. The symbiote whispered in his ear, urging him forward, filling him with anger and righteous fury. Eddie's lips curled into a scowl, the weight of his suit amplifying every ounce of bitterness in his heart. His father, a brilliant man, had been overshadowed, his work dismissed and ignored, and Peter, who had the knowledge, who had the legacy of their father's combined work, had simply walked away from it all. Peter had become weak, consumed by his own guilt and pain, choosing to hide behind the mask of Spider-Man instead of embracing the truth. Eddie rejected him, rejected everything he once thought was right about their shared past. To Eddie, Peter's betrayal was unforgivable. He clenched his fist, the symbiote's power pulsing through him, filling him with a sense of purpose that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The city below him now seemed so small, its streets teeming with corruption and weakness. Eddie could feel the wrongness in the air, the people who preyed on the innocent, those who took from others without remorse. They needed to be punished. They needed to be cleansed. And Spider-Man, Peter, he was no different. Eddie's lips parted, his voice cold and unwavering as the symbiote took hold of him fully. You don't get to hide behind your mask anymore, Parker. You abandoned it all. You abandoned the legacy. His mind, now consumed by the symbiote's influence, twisted his feelings into something darker. He believed he was a saviour, a force sent to punish the world for its failings. Peter's weakness disgusted him. His inability to embrace the full potential of their father's work repulsed Eddie. The symbiote reinforced his anger, encouraging him to act on his righteous fury to bring the world to its knees. And Peter would be the first to feel his wrath. Eddie's fists clenched again, and he knew deep down in his gut that he would bring down the very man he had once considered a brother. The city was his to reclaim, and Peter Parker would be the first lesson in what happened when you abandoned what was right. The early morning light poured into Peter Parker's apartment, casting long golden beams that cut through the quiet. The stillness of the city outside was broken by the sound of a crash. Boom! Agent Venom, Eddie Brock, fully consumed by the symbiote, had just punched through the wall of Peter's apartment, the impact sending a shockwave through the room. His black suit gleamed in the daylight, the shifting tendrils of the symbiote swirling around his form like a living weapon. From his arms, a series of symbiote-made firearms materialized. Sleek and deadly, the black liquid turning solid and lethal at his command. Eddie's eyes scanned the room, glowing with a cold, unyielding light. He had been tracking Peter, hunting him ever since the transformation, and now here he was, standing in the heart of the apartment he knew so well. Yet, something was off. Peter wasn't here. The space was empty, quiet, save for the faint hum of the city, but Eddie could feel it, the faintest trace of Peter's presence lingering in the air. He gritted his teeth, the anger rising inside him like an uncontrollable tide. "Parker, I know you're here." He paced through the apartment, tearing through furniture with his symbiote-enhanced strength. The walls cracked under the pressure, the wooden tables splintering like twigs. His weapons shifted and fired, leaving holes in the walls, in the ceiling. The apartment was a mess in seconds. But Peter was nowhere to be found. Eddie's frustration grew, his voice low and filled with venom as he muttered to himself, "Hiding from me, Peter. You can't run forever." Unbeknownst to Eddie, Peter was already outside of the apartment, crouched on the edge of a nearby rooftop, watching the destruction unfold below. He had sensed the presence of his old friend, the familiar sting of his spider sense, warning him of the danger before the first crash. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He couldn't let Eddie find him here, not like this. He waited for the perfect moment, his mind racing. With a sudden flick of his wrist, Peter launched a webbing line from his wrist and swung high into the air, his body propelling forward with ease. He zipped through the streets, moving fast and fluid, getting distance from the battle as he planned his next move. As he soared through the city, the sunlight glinted off the black suit Eddie wore, catching Peter's eye for a brief moment as he swung past. He knew what was coming. Peter landed with a roll on a nearby rooftop, adjusting his stance as he crouched below. The battle was about to begin, and this time, things would be different. He could feel the weight of the symbiote pressing down on Eddie. He could feel the rage that flowed through him. But Peter wasn't afraid, not of Eddie, and not of the suit. He was Spider-Man, and he would protect the city, no matter the cost. Without hesitation, Peter shot a webbing line across the rooftop and swung back towards the apartment. He could already hear Eddie's voice, low and guttural, calling out his name in fury. "Peter!" The air was thick with tension as the two forces collided, the roar of battle filling the streets below. The city felt like it was holding its breath. The sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, but the air was still thick with the tension of what was to come. High above, atop a crumbling rooftop, the two forces collided in a storm of fury and power. Peter Parker and Eddie Brock, once friends, now enemies, stood locked in a battle that was as raw and personal as it was destructive. Agent Venom, the symbiote's dark influence taking control, was a force unlike any Peter had ever faced. Eddie's movements were quick and brutal, each strike enhanced by the symbiote's strength and speed, every punch landing with the force of a freight train. I can't speak. The black suit pulsed with power, tendrils shooting out to whip around Peter, forcing him on the defensive. Peter fought back with everything he had, using his agility to dodge and weave, relying on his spider sense to stay one step ahead. But every time he landed a blow, Eddie's resilience, enhanced by the symbiote, was enough to shrug it off. It was like fighting a machine, relentless, unyielding, and far too strong. "You're weak, Peter," Eddie roared, his voice distorted by the symbiote. The black suit writhed around him, tendrils lashing out like a serpent. "You gave up on everything. You abandoned your father's legacy. You turned your back on what's right." Peter's chest tightened at the words. They stung deeper than any physical blow could, but he knew it wasn't really Eddie talking. It was the venom of the symbiote twisting his thoughts. The rage has consumed him, turning the man Peter once called a friend into something almost unrecognizable. "I didn't abandon anything," Peter shouted, struggling to keep his footing as he blocked another brutal strike. His arms ached, his chest burned, but he couldn't give up. He couldn't lose to Eddie. Not like this. You're the one who's lost. This isn't you, Eddie. You don't have to do this." But the words didn't reach Eddie. Not anymore. The symbiote had fully taken control, and there was no turning back. Eddie's fist landed in Peter's side with a sickening crack, sending him tumbling across the rooftop. The force of the blow left him gasping for breath. His body screamed with pain, but he couldn't let up. If he did, Eddie would destroy everyone Peter cared about. Peter rose to his feet, but his movements were slower now, each breath coming in ragged grasps. The symbiote was too strong. He was running on fumes, his body betraying him as he fought to keep his focus. He had to stop Eddie, but how? How could he stop a monster that was once his friend? The black suit pulsed, and Eddie charged again. Fast this time, his tendrils reaching for Peter's throat. In that moment, Peter saw the full extent of Eddie's transformation. His eyes glowing white, his face twisted in an expression of pure hatred. The rage and the fury that the symbiote had birthed were overwhelming, but Peter wasn't going to let that be the end. Peter focused. With a sudden burst of energy, he ducked beneath Eddie's attack, spinning around to land a series of quick strikes to his old friend's chest, each punch with precision, but he could feel the toll it was taking on his body. His muscles were on fire, his movement slower now. The symbiote's strength was overwhelming, but Peter refused to stop. "You're not going to win this, Eddie," Peter grunted, his voice strange. "This isn't who you are. You're not this." Eddie growled, his mouth curling into a twisted smile. "I am. This is me now, Parker. This world is broken and I'm the only one who can fix it." The symbiote's tendrils shot out, wrapping around Peter's limbs, pulling him off his feet and slamming him into the ground. He gasped as the air was knocked from his lungs, but he didn't stop fighting. He couldn't. He fought through the pain, through the suffocating grip of the symbiote, and with a surge of willpower, Peter ripped himself free. Peter swung with everything he had left, landing a devastating blow to Eddie's side. Eddie staggered back, stunned, and Peter seized the moment. "I'm sorry, Eddie," Peter whispered, with his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want this." With a desperate final push, Peter launched himself at Eddie. Using his agility to slip past the symbiote's tendrils, he landed a final punch. A punch that sent Eddie sprawling to the ground, unconscious. The battle was over. Peter stood over his fallen friend, his breath ragged, his body battered and broken. The symbiote slithered, defeated, from Eddie's body, but Peter didn't feel victorious. He just felt exhausted. And the city stretched before him. Peter knew that the battle wasn't truly over. The symbiote's power, the dark legacy of their father's work, was still out there, in some form at least. Epilogue. The apartment was quiet once again, save for the soft rustle of the wind outside. Peter sat in the small bedroom, his eyes fixated on the closet door in front of him. It was ajar, and within, hanging in the back of the wall, was a familiar item, a jacket that Gwen had once worn. Its fabric, slightly faded with time, still carried the warmth of her memory. the weight of everything he had lost. Peter smiled softly to himself. It wasn't much, but it was a piece of her, a tangible reminder that despite everything, she was still a part of him. The grief never fully went away, but he had learned to carry it with him, not as a burden, but as part of his past that shaped who he was. He reached for the jacket, fingers brushing gently over the fabric, and for the first time in a long time, the tightness in his chest loosened. He wasn't ready to let go. He never would be, but he was learning how to live alongside that pain. And in that moment, he felt a quiet sense of peace, a glimpse of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. There was life after loss. It was different, but it was there. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Peter?" came a familiar voice. Mary Jane. He turned, quickly slipping the jacket back into the closet before walking towards the door. When he opened it, there she was, standing in the hallway with a gentle smile on her face. "Hey, MJ," Peter greeted, his voice steady, though his heart beat a little faster. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for a moment before resting on Peter. There was a softness in her expression now, a kind of understanding that hadn't been there before. That it was as if they had both walked through their own darkness and found their way back into the light. "Everything okay?" she asked, concern in her eyes. Peter paused, looking at her. He thought about everything that had happened, the battles, the pain, the journey he had been on. He thought about Gwen, about Eddie, and about how he had finally started to piece his life back together, bit by bit. "I think it is," he said, his voice quiet but sure. A smile tugged at the corner of Mary Jane's lips. "Good. It's about time, Peter." Peter chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck. "Yeah, I think so too." There's a long pause, both of them standing in the doorway, unsure of what came next. Peter's heart raced again, but this time it wasn't from fear or anxiety, it was in nervous excitement. He took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say what had been on his mind for weeks now. "Hey, MJ," he began, his voice a little shaky but determined. "Would you, want to go out for a meal sometime?" Her eyes softened, and she tilted her head slightly, the hint of a smile growing. "Are you asking me out on a date, Peter Parker?" Peter's breath caught on his throat, but he didn't back down. For the first time in years, he felt certain about something. He worked up the courage to meet her gaze, his eyes clear and steady. "Yeah," he said, his voice strong now. "I think I am." Mary Jane's smile widened. Peter felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. She stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his arm. "I'd like that," she said softly. And with that moment, Peter realised that while the past would always be a part of him, the future was waiting, and it was a future he was ready to embrace. I'm not going to write this down all fancy and stuff, but essentially the post-credit scene is Peter, doing a bunch of superhero stuff, a little quick montage of him saving people, stuff like that. But eventually, he, after a long day, he starts to go into a dark alleyway and just sit there because he's just a bit tired. And suddenly he sees a portal, like a magic Doctor Strange portal. And this leads directly into No Way Home. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's, I think, probably the longest I've ever made. It definitely took me a while. I mean a while. It's basically taken me watching every single Spider-Man movie. I mean, I didn't do it for this video, but, still, it took me that long. And I also had to write all of this, which took many years off my life. So I'd really appreciate if you like, comment, and subscribe. Especially, most people say especially comment. Most people say especially like. Most people say especially subscribe, but I'm going to encourage you especially comment, because that makes my day. I like to hear what you guys want to say. So, anyway, I will see you in another video. Alright, see ya.